Hey guys, tonight there is a kind of fear that does not scream. It goes quiet instead. It sits very still in a cold room and tries to make a plan. On the night of the 12th of February in the year 1542, inside the grey stone walls of the Tower of London, a girl asked for a favor. She was told that Sunday evening that she would die in the morning. And after they told her, after the door had closed and the candles had burned low, she made a request that has unsettled everyone who has ever heard it. She asked that the wooden block, the same block upon which her head would be, struck from her body the next morning, be carried into her room that night. She wanted it brought to her, and then, by the account of the imperial ambassador who recorded it, she made trial of it. The surviving report does not tell us exactly how long she rehearsed, or how many times she lowered herself toward it. It tells us only that she had the block brought in so she might know how to place herself when the axe came. Try to hold that picture for a moment before we do anything else with it. A young woman, probably still in her teens, kneeling in the dark, lowering her face toward the instrument of her own execution, so that when the moment came, she would not flinch, would not fumble, would not make a mess of the one death she was given. She was not preparing a speech of defiance. She was not plotting an escape. She was teaching herself how to die well, because dying well was the last thing left to her that she could control. Her name was Catherine Howard. For 16 months she had been Queen of England, the wife of the most powerful and the most dangerous man in the kingdom, Henry VIII. He had celebrated her as his rose without a thorn, and only days before the scandal broke, he had ordered thanks to be given for the happiness of his marriage. And now, on the orders of that same man, the people of the court were sharpening an axe, and she was on her knees in a stone room, measuring her own neck against the block. Tonight, we are going to sit with that girl, not the cartoon, not the punchline. For nearly 500 years, Catherine Howard has been handed down to us as a kind of joke. The foolish little queen, the giddy girl who could not keep her head in every sense of that phrase. She has been called a floozy and a fool and worse in serious history books and in films and in idle conversation, as though her death were the natural and slightly comic consequence of being young and silly. We are going to take all of that apart, carefully, with the actual records in our hands, because when you put the cartoon down and look at what the documents actually say, you do not find a silly girl at all. You find a child who was failed by nearly every adult who ever had charge of her, handed from neglect to abuse to a throne, and then destroyed by the very position that was supposed to be her triumph. Before we go any further, let me say this plainly, because it matters and because it shapes everything that follows. This is not a story built on rumor. Almost everything we will look at tonight survives in letters, in confessions written in the people's own hands, in the reports of ambassadors who were standing in the room, in acts of parliament. Where something is only legend, I will tell you it is legend, and I will tell you who invented it. Where the sources disagree, I will show you the disagreement instead of choosing the version that sounds best. And there is one famous line in particular, a line you have almost certainly heard attached to this very scene, that we are going to drag into the light and expose for exactly what it is. But that comes later. First, we have to understand how a girl ends up kneeling beside a block in the dark. And to understand that, we cannot start at the tower. We have to go back past the throne, past the wedding, past the men in the dark, all the way back to a crowded house where a little girl was sent to be raised, and where, it turned out, almost no one was watching her at all. If stories like hers matter to you, the ones the powerful would have preferred to keep small, the ones that were buried under a convenient joke, then stay with me and subscribe, because that is precisely the kind of history this channel exists to pull back into the light. So, let us leave the cold room for now. We will return to it. We will return to that block and that long, terrible night, and when we do, you will understand it completely. But to get there, we have to begin somewhere gentler and somewhere far more ordinary. We have to begin with a child nobody quite wanted. The name Howard was one of the grandest in all of England. It carried the weight of dukedoms and battlefields and royal blood. The Howards were the premier noble family of the realm, close enough to the throne to feel its warmth and close enough to feel its heat. To be born a Howard was to be born into the very top of the world, and yet Catherine, born a Howard, was born into something much closer to genteel poverty, and that contradiction is the first key to her whole life. She came into the world around the year 1522 or 1523. We cannot fix the date precisely, because no one at the time thought a younger daughter of a minor branch worth recording with any care, which tells you almost everything about her standing at birth. Her father was Lord Edmund Howard, and Lord Edmund had the misfortune of being a younger son. In a system where the eldest son inherited the title, the estates, and the money, the younger sons inherited mostly the name and the expectations, and Edmund Howard spent his life crushed between the two. He had the bearing of a great lord and the bank account of a struggling one. He was perpetually, humiliatingly in debt, forever writing letters, begging relatives, and the crown for posts and pensions and relief from his creditors. The grandeur was real and the money was gone, and Catherine grew up inside that gap. Her mother was Joyce Culpeper, and here we meet a detail that will matter enormously later, though no one in the household could have guessed it at the time. Joyce had been married before to a man named Ralph Lee, and she brought 5 children from that first marriage into her second. Then she gave Edmund Howard a houseful more. By the time you count them all together, Catherine was somewhere around the 10th child her mother had borne. She was one face in a crowd of half-siblings and full siblings, in a household where there was never quite enough, not enough money, not enough rooms, not enough attention to go around. And then, while Catherine was still very young, her mother died. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the quiet wound underneath everything. A little girl, low in the order of a large and cash-strapped family, loses her mother early. Her father is a proud, distracted, indebted man with too many mouths to feed and too little to feed them with. There is no one whose particular job it is to watch over this one small daughter, to teach her, to guard her, to notice her. In our own time, we would call that a child slipping through the cracks. In Tudor England, it had a tidier and more brutal solution. A child who could not be properly maintained at home, but who had a noble name to protect, was simply sent away, handed off to a wealthier relative to be raised and finished in a great household. It was considered an opportunity. For Catherine, it would prove to be the opposite, and so, at around the age of 10, perhaps 12, Catherine Howard was sent to live in the household of her step-grandmother. Her name was Agnes Howard, born Agnes Tilney, and she held the title of Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, the widow of Catherine's grandfather, the old Duke. The Dowager Duchess was one of the wealthiest and most influential women in the entire country, and her households were exactly the kind of grand establishment where a noble girl was supposed to be polished into a marriageable lady. There were 2 principal residences. One was Chesworth House, a sprawling country seat near Horsham, in Sussex. The other was a great town house at Lambeth, directly across the wide grey river from the city of London and from the palaces of the king. To a poor relation, it must have looked like rescue. A roof, fine company, the proximity of power, the chance to become someone. But the Dowager Duchess's household ran on a principle that would, in time, prove lethal. The old woman presided over an enormous, sprawling establishment crammed with young people, wards and attendants, and the children of lesser relatives. Dozens of them, girls and young men together, along with the servants and musicians and hangers-on that orbited any great house. And over all of these young people the Duchess exercised only the loosest possible supervision. She was important, she was busy, she was often at court or attending to her vast affairs. The day-to-day reality of life among her young charges was, by every later account, remarkably unsupervised. The adults who were supposed to be in charge were elsewhere, or indifferent, or both. At the heart of this world was a place that would later be named, over and over, in the documents that destroyed Catherine, the Maiden's Chamber. This was the long dormitory where the young women of the household slept together. By custom and by the Duchess's instruction, the chamber was locked at night, the door secured, and the key kept by the older women, so that the girls would be shut safely away until morning. That was the theory. The lock was meant to be a wall between the sleeping girls and the rest of the house. In practice, as we will see, a locked door in a house where no one is truly watching is not a wall at all. It is merely a door that someone has to find the key to. So, this was Catherine Howard's childhood. Not the warm, ordered nursery of a cherished daughter, but the crowded, glittering, careless household of a great lady who had 100 more important things to attend to than one motherless girl among many. She arrived as a child. She could read and write a little. Her education was patchy, and she would never be a learned woman, which later critics would hold against her as though it were a moral failing rather than the predictable result of being raised by no one in particular. What she learned instead was how to be charming, how to dance, how to please, how to be agreeable and pretty and pliant, in a house where being agreeable and pretty was the only currency a girl like her possessed. She learned to seek warmth wherever it was offered, because so little of it had ever been offered reliably to her. And it is exactly here, into this unwatched house, into the life of this affection-starved girl who had been taught that pleasing people was her purpose, that the first of the men arrived. He came, of all things, as a teacher. He was hired to give the young people of the household their music lessons, to instruct them in the lute and the virginals, the keyboard instrument of the age. He was older than Catherine. He was in a position of trust and authority over her, the way a teacher always is over a child. His name was Henry Manox, and what he began with her, in that careless house, would still be killing her on a scaffold years later. But to understand what Manox did, and the man who came after him, and why none of it was the fault of the child it happened to, we have to step closer, into the dark of the Maiden's Chamber itself. We have to be careful here, and we have to be honest, because this is the part of the story that has been told most often and understood least. For centuries, what happened to Catherine Howard in the Dowager Duchess's house was described in a knowing, winking way as her early adventures, her youthful indiscretions, the loose behavior that would later catch up with her. Read the documents with clear eyes, however, and a different word forces itself forward. What happened to Catherine in that house was not adventure. It was the grooming and the sexual abuse of a child by older men in an environment where the adults who should have stopped it were not looking. The first of them was the music teacher, Henry Manox. He was a young man of the household, brought in to instruct the girls on the lute and the virginals, and the lessons gave him exactly what a predator requires: proximity, privacy, and authority over a child. Catherine was around 13. By his own later admission, and by hers, Manox began to touch her. Years afterward, when all of this was being dragged out of frightened witnesses, Catherine described it in words that have survived, and the words are the words of someone explaining how an adult worked on a child. She said that at his flattering and fair persuasions, being but a young girl, she suffered him to handle and touch the intimate parts of her body. And then she added the line that ought to have shamed everyone who later mocked her, that this neither became her to permit nor him to require. She understood, even as a condemned woman, that the requiring had been his. The fault, in her own telling, lay with the grown man who asked it of a child. Manox, for his part, behaved exactly as the worst kind of man behaves, he boasted. He told people in the household of the liberties he had taken with the Duchess's young charge. He bragged that he knew a private mark on her body, a secret that he wielded like a trophy. He spoke of her as a conquest, and the household, that loosely supervised house, mostly let it happen. At one point, word of the closeness reached the Dowager Duchess, who reacted not by protecting the girl, but by striking her and forbidding the connection, punishing the child for the behavior of the man. Then the great lady's attention drifted elsewhere, as it always did, and the watching stopped again. By around 1538, Manox had been displaced. Not because anyone rescued Catherine, but because a second man entered the picture, a man of higher standing whom Catherine, now perhaps 14, came to prefer. His name was Francis Dereham, and he was a gentleman in the Dowager Duchess's service, older than Catherine, well-placed, able to court her with the gifts and the confidence that the music master could not match. And what unfolded between Dereham and Catherine was no longer the furtive touching of a creeping Tudor. It was treated, by the two of them and by half the household, as something close to a marriage. This is where the locked door of the maiden's chamber becomes so important and so damning of the people in charge. The chamber was supposed to be sealed at night. So, Catherine, by the testimony given later, persuaded one of the other young women, a maid named Mary Lascelles, to steal the key. Remember that name, Lascelles. Tuck it away. It will come back at the very worst possible moment, and it will be the thread that unravels everything. With the stolen key, the door of the maiden's chamber was quietly unlocked at night, and Dereham was admitted, and so were other young men to other young women, and the supposedly secure dormitory became the opposite of secure. Witnesses later described the scene almost fondly. The young people would slip in after dark and bring food and drink, and they would feast and laugh together into the small hours of the morning, wine and strawberries and apples and other things to make good cheer, as one of them put it. And in the beds, behind the curtains, Dereham and Catherine carried on as though they were husband and wife. They used exactly those words for each other. Husband, wife. It was not a private joke. It was said openly enough that the household knew. Dereham, when he went away across the sea to Ireland for a time, left money in Catherine's keeping, the way a husband, entrusting his wife with the household purse, might do. One of the other girls in the chamber became so uneasy at what she was seeing that she declared she would no longer share a bed near them, because, and this phrase is preserved, she knew not what matrimony was, meaning she could not tell whether what was happening between Dereham and Catherine made them married or not. And that uncertainty, that exact uncertainty, was a loaded weapon that would not be fired for years. Under the law of the church in that age, a man and a woman who freely exchanged words of present consent, who said to each other, in effect, I take you as my husband, I take you as my wife, and who then consummated that promise, were in the eyes of the church genuinely, bindingly married, with or without a priest, with or without a ceremony. It was called a pre-contract. If Catherine Howard and Francis Dereham had done that, if their bed games in the maiden's chamber amounted to a true exchange of consent, then in the strictest legal sense Catherine had a husband before she ever met the king. Nobody in that giggling, feasting dormitory was thinking about canon law. They were teenagers in an unsupervised house. But the question they were too young to take seriously would one day be put to grown men in the Tower of London, and the answer would help to decide whether Catherine lived or died. Here is the thing to hold on to as we leave the maiden's chamber behind. Catherine did not engineer any of this from a position of strength. She was a motherless child, low in her family, raised by a great lady who could not be bothered to watch her, preyed upon first by a boastful music master, and then drawn into a quasi-marriage with an older gentleman, in a house that treated all of it as ordinary. She was, in every meaningful sense, a victim of the adults around her. And then, just as suddenly as she had been deposited into that world, she was plucked out of it because her grand, ambitious relatives finally found a use for the pretty Howard girl with the agreeable manner. She was summoned to court. A place was found for her among the ladies who attended the Queen, and the moment she stepped into that gilded, watchful, lethal world, every careless secret of the maiden's chamber, the music master's boasting, the stolen key, the husband and wife, the pre-contract nobody had defined, became a buried mine with the fuse already laid. All it would take was one person, years later, who remembered. But before the mine could go off, the impossible happened. The forgotten daughter, the abused child, the girl nobody had watched, caught the eye of the King of England himself. To understand why Catherine Howard was thrown into the path of Henry VIII, you have to understand that she was not really chosen for herself at all. She was chosen as a move in a game her family had nearly lost. The Howards had already gambled one of their girls on the king's bed, and the gamble had ended on a scaffold. Anne Boleyn. The Queen Henry had torn the country apart to marry, breaking with the Pope, remaking the Church, defying all of Europe. Anne Boleyn was Catherine's own first cousin. Anne's mother and Catherine's father had been sister and brother, both children of the Howard line. And in the spring of 1536, Anne had been accused of adultery and treason, convicted on evidence that crumbles the moment you examine it, and beheaded inside the Tower of London. Her fall had dragged the whole Howard family down with her into disgrace and danger. For an ambitious dynasty, that was not a reason to stay away from the throne. It was a debt to be recovered. They had put a Howard on the throne once. They could do it again, and this time perhaps do it better. The man driving that ambition was Catherine's uncle, Thomas Howard, the 3rd Duke of Norfolk, the head of the family, a hard, cold, supremely self-interested political survivor who had helped send his own niece Anne to her death when it suited him, and who now looked at his other niece, young Catherine, and saw not a girl but an opportunity. All he needed was the right moment to place her where the king would see her. And in 1540, the king handed him that moment, because Henry VIII was, at that point, a deeply unhappy and deeply dangerous man, trapped in a marriage he could not stand. Earlier that year, he had wed his 4th wife, Anne of Cleves, a German princess, in a match arranged for diplomatic reasons by his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. Henry had taken one look at his new bride and decided he wanted nothing to do with her. The marriage was a misery to him and, by all accounts, was never truly a marriage at all in the physical sense. And the king, being the king, did not blame himself. He blamed the man who had arranged it. Cromwell, the most powerful servant in the kingdom, the architect of so much of Henry's revolution, was suddenly a man whose head was loose on his shoulders. Into that household of an unwanted German queen, the Howards placed their pretty, charming, agreeable young cousin as a maid of honor, and the king began to notice her. We should be clear-eyed about what Henry was by 1540, because the gap between the king and the girl is one of the most important truths in this entire story. In his youth, Henry had been magnificent, tall, well over 6 feet, athletic, golden, the very picture of a Renaissance prince, a champion in the tilt yard, and a marvel to foreign visitors. That man was gone. The Henry who fixed his attention on Catherine Howard was approaching 50 years old. He had grown enormously fat. And he was in chronic, grinding pain, because some years earlier a jousting accident had left him with a wound in his leg that never properly healed. It had turned into a foul, ulcerated sore that wept and stank and periodically clogged, sending him into fevers and agonies that could black his moods for days. He was a sick, suffering, swollen, aging man with a temper that had curdled, over the years, into something genuinely frightening. The people closest to him had learned that his affection could turn to lethal rage with terrible speed. They had watched it happen to Anne Boleyn. They were, at that very moment, watching it happen to Cromwell, and it was to this man, pained, paranoid, immense, and around 30 years older than she was, that a teenage girl with no power of her own was delivered as a prize. Events moved quickly because Henry's wants moved quickly. In July of 1540, his marriage to Anne of Cleves was formally annulled. Anne, far more sensible than her predecessor, agreed to everything, accepted a handsome settlement and a comfortable life, and was henceforth styled the king's beloved sister. She would, in the end, outlive every other one of Henry's wives, precisely because she understood that the only safe thing to do with this king was to stop being his wife as gracefully as possible. With Anne set aside, Henry was free, and on the 28th of July, 1540, he married Catherine Howard. Hold that date in your mind, the 28th of July, 1540, because of what else happened on it. On the very same day that the king married his young new bride, his fallen minister, Thomas Cromwell, was led out to be executed. As Catherine was being made a wife, the most powerful man in England outside the king himself was being made a corpse. The wedding and the beheading shared a single date. It is the kind of grim coincidence that the Tudor court produced almost casually, and it should have stood as a warning to everyone present, written in the plainest possible terms. In Henry's world, the distance between his favor and the executioner was sometimes no distance at all. The same hand that lifted you up could sign the warrant that ended you, and it could do both in the same week. Catherine, probably still a teenager and dazzled, cannot have understood the lesson that her own wedding day was teaching. Almost no one ever did, until it was their turn. For now, though, she was queen, and for a few short months she was a sensation. Henry was besotted with her in the particular, intense way of an old and ailing man who has been handed back a piece of his youth. He called her his rose without a thorn, a rose with no capacity to wound him, all sweetness and no danger. Catherine adopted a queenly motto in French: no other will but his. It was meant to signal perfect obedience, but in hindsight it reads almost cruelly, the motto of a girl whose free will would be steadily taken from her. He covered her in jewels and gowns and lands, lavishing on this teenage girl the kind of wealth she had never dreamed of in the cash-starved households of her childhood. After a life of being overlooked, unwatched, and used, Catherine Howard was suddenly the most adored woman in all of England, and that adoration, this is the cruel hinge of the whole story, that adoration was not her safety, it was her trap, because the higher Henry raised her, the more public and absolute her position became, the more catastrophic and the more inevitable her destruction would be if a single secret ever surfaced. A poor relation in an unsupervised house can have a buried past and survive it. The Queen of England cannot. Every careless thing that had ever happened in the maiden's chamber was now attached to the body of a reigning queen, and the man she was married to had already demonstrated, twice over, exactly what he did to wives and servants who disappointed him. The rose had been set in the king's crown, and roses, even ones without thorns, do not last long once they have been cut. For a little while, the trap was beautiful. Catherine Howard came to the throne knowing nothing of how to be a queen, and in some ways, that was the point of her. The king did not want another Anne Boleyn, sharp and political and dangerous. He did not want a learned woman who would argue theology with him. He wanted youth and prettiness and gaiety, and a wife who would make him feel, for an hour at a time, like the golden prince he had once been instead of the swollen, suffering man he had become. And in those first months, Catherine gave him exactly that. The court filled with music and dancing again. She loved fine clothes, and she loved jewels, and the king, delighting in her delight, poured both upon her without limit. She was perhaps 18 or 19, surrounded by splendor, the center of every eye in England. After a childhood of being unwatched and unwanted, she was now watched by everyone, and, for the moment, wanted most of all. It would be easy to leave the portrait there, the giddy girl drowning happily in silk. That is, more or less, the portrait history kept. But the records preserve something else about Catherine's brief queenship, something that the people who reduced her to a punchline always conveniently forgot. And it deserves to be said clearly, because it is one of the few windows we have into what kind of person she actually was when she had a moment of power and a choice about how to use it. She was kind to the people the king had thrown away. Consider the case of Margaret Pole. Margaret was the Countess of Salisbury, an old woman of royal Plantagenet blood, one of the last of the line that had ruled England before the Tudors. For that crime, the crime of her ancestry, and the suspected loyalties of her family, Henry had imprisoned her in the Tower of London for nearly 2 years, an elderly woman held for the politics and loyalties of her family. She was not forgotten entirely. The records suggest she was maintained at the king's expense, but she was still a royal prisoner, waiting under a sentence that could be awakened at any moment. And the young queen, hearing of it, did something quiet and merciful. The records connect Margaret's prison clothing to Catherine Howard's own personal tailor. We cannot know how much of that mercy came directly from Catherine's hand, but the connection matters. In the same tower where Margaret waited under Henry's anger, the young queen's household was tied to one of the few small comforts the old countess received. It was not a grand political gesture. It changed nothing about Margaret Pole's doom. The countess would be dragged out and butchered to death the following spring in one of the most horrifying executions of the entire reign, hacked at again and again by an inexperienced headsman. But for a time, a frightened old prisoner had some small comfort connected to the young queen's household. And that is enough to show that Catherine's brief power was not spent only on jewels and gowns. Hold on to the memory of how Margaret Pole died. It will matter terribly when we come to Catherine's own last night. There was more. Catherine used what influence she had with her infatuated husband to plead for mercy on behalf of others who had fallen under the king's suspicion. The poet and diplomat Thomas Wyatt, a man with deep and dangerous connections to the disgraced Cromwell, and, years before, a man rumored to have loved Anne Boleyn, had been arrested and stood in real peril. Catherine interceded for him. Wyatt was released. A young queen, who could so easily have spent every ounce of her new power on gowns and amusements, spent some of it instead, trying to soften the edges of her husband's cruelty toward people who had nothing to offer her in return. That is not the behavior of a heartless fool. It is the behavior of someone who, having been powerless and overlooked herself, recognized the powerless and the overlooked and reached toward them. But here is the shadow that lay across all of it, the thing that makes those first bright months so unbearable to watch, with the knowledge of what was coming. A queen of Henry VIII had one supreme and non-negotiable duty, and it was not kindness and it was not dancing. It was to give the king a son. Henry already had one boy, the Prince Edward, born to his third wife, but a single male heir in an age of high mortality was a thin and frightening thread on which to hang a dynasty. Henry wanted more sons, a spare, a second duke to make the succession safe. That was the real, cold purpose of the rose without a thorn. And the months were passing, and Catherine was not pregnant. No child came. The clock that ran beneath every Tudor marriage, the relentless, merciless clock of fertility, was already ticking against her, quietly, even at the height of her glory. And while that clock ticked, the girl at the center of all this adoration made a series of choices that, with the knowledge we now have, are almost unbearable to follow. She was lonely in a particular way that only the watched can be lonely. She was married to a man in his 50s whose ruined leg made him, at times, an invalid. A man whose moods could turn to terror without warning. She was a teenager surrounded by young people her own age, in a court humming with flirtation and intrigue, and she had been shaped since childhood to seek affection wherever it was offered, and to find her worth in pleasing. She had never once, in her entire life, been taught caution because no one had ever cared enough to teach her anything at all. So, she let two people get close to her. One was a woman, an older, experienced lady of the court, who became her confidant and her go-between. The other was a young man of the king's own household, handsome and favored, who began to occupy the queen's thoughts in a way that no queen of Henry VIII could ever afford. To understand how Catherine walked, open-eyed and yet entirely blind, toward the scaffold, we have to understand these two people, the woman who carried the messages and the man they were carried to. And we have to start with the woman, because she had already survived one Tudor catastrophe, and she should, of all people, have known better. Her name was Jane Boleyn, and she carried the title Lady Rochford, and she is one of the strangest and most haunted figures in this entire story, because she had stood at the edge of the abyss before and walked away, only to walk straight back toward it a second time. Jane had married into the Boleyn family at the very summit of their power. Her husband was George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, the brother of Queen Anne Boleyn, a glittering, clever young courtier at the dazzling center of the king's affections. For a time, Jane was sister-in-law to the Queen of England, a woman at the heart of the most powerful family in the realm. And then, in the spring of 1536, that whole world detonated. When Henry turned against Anne, the destruction did not stop with the Queen. Her brother George was swept up in the same monstrous accusations, charged, almost unbelievably, with having committed incest with his own sister as part of the lurid pile of treason invented to bring Anne down. George Boleyn was convicted on this grotesque charge and beheaded just days before Anne herself. In the space of a single fortnight, Jane Boleyn went from being the sister-in-law of the Queen to being the widow of a man executed for incest with that Queen. Her husband was dead. Her family was annihilated. She had watched, up close, exactly how the Tudor court devoured the people who got too near the throne. What precisely Jane's own role was in the catastrophe of 1536 has been argued over for centuries, and here I want to be honest with you rather than tidy, because the tidy version is unfair to her. For a long time, it was simply assumed and repeated that Jane Boleyn had given the damning evidence against her own husband and sister-in-law, that she had been the jealous wife who whispered the lie of incest that sent George to the block. It made a satisfying villain of her. But modern historians who have actually gone back to the surviving records have found that the evidence for this is far thinner than the legend insists. The story of Jane as the great betrayer of 1536 may itself be largely a later invention, layered on top of a woman who was, more probably, just another terrified survivor of a purge she did not control. We do not actually know that she destroyed her own family. What we do know is that she lived when so many around her died, and that she found her way back into royal service afterward, because for a widow of her rank, service to the queen was livelihood, security, a place in the world. She had no fortune of her own to retreat to. The court had taken everything from her, and the court was also the only place she had left to survive in. And so Jane Boleyn returned. She served in the household of queen after queen, a senior, experienced lady-in-waiting, until she found herself attending the youngest and least worldly queen of them all, Catherine Howard. The two women grew close. Catherine, motherless her whole life, with no one who had ever truly guided her, leaned on this older, knowing woman who had seen everything the court could do. And Jane, for reasons that remain genuinely mysterious, loyalty, affection, the desire to be needed, perhaps a recklessness born of having already lost everything once, made herself indispensable to the young queen in the most dangerous way imaginable. She became the keeper of Catherine's secrets and the arranger of Catherine's private meetings. She carried the messages. She watched the doors. She, who had stood in the wreckage of 1536 and knew in her bones what happened to those who played games near Henry's marriage bed, became the very person who made the next set of games possible. It is one of the great unanswered questions of the whole tragedy. Why would a survivor walk back into the fire? Why would the woman who had buried a husband executed for a queen's supposed crimes turn around and help another young queen toward exactly the kind of secret that got people killed? We will never fully know what was in Jane Boleyn's mind, but we know what she did, and we know that without her, without an experienced older woman willing to stand watch in the dark and usher a young man up a private stair, the meetings that destroyed Catherine Howard could never have happened at all. Because there was a young man, and of all the men Catherine could have allowed near her, of all the dangerous choices available to a teenage queen, she had fixed her attention on perhaps the single most dangerous one in the entire court. A favorite of the king's own body, a man who attended Henry in his most private chambers, a man whose face the king saw every single day. His name was Thomas Culpeper, and to understand why the meetings with him were not merely scandalous, but lethal, treasonous, a death sentence in waiting, you have to understand who he was, and you have to follow Catherine and Jane and the whole vast court out of the safety of the palace and onto the long, fateful road north. Thomas Culpeper was the kind of young man the Tudor court produced and then consumed. He was a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, one of the small, elite group of men who attended Henry in his most intimate moments, who dressed him and waited on his body and shared his confidence. It was a position of extraordinary trust and access. The king was genuinely fond of him, and he was, by the standards of the court, attractive, charming, ambitious, and well aware of his own favor. He was also, distantly, a kinsman of Catherine's own family on her mother's side, which gave the two of them an easy, plausible reason to be acquainted. The records hint, too, at a darker side to the Culpeper name, at least one violent scandal attached to a man of that name in those years, though the sources are tangled enough that historians cannot be certain whether the worst of it belonged to this particular Thomas Culpeper or to a relative who shared it. What is not in doubt is that the man Catherine grew close to stood at the very heart of the king's private world, which meant that any betrayal involving him struck at Henry in the most personal place imaginable. The thing began, as far as we can tell, in the ordinary intimacy of the court, glances and small kindnesses and the dangerous pleasure of being noticed by someone, young when your husband is old and ailing, but it deepened into something that required secrecy and arrangement and risk. And that is where Lady Rochford came in, standing watch, finding the rooms, managing the comings and goings. And the whole of it came to its reckless height, not in the familiar safety of the great palaces near London, but on the road, during the enormous royal journey that the court undertook in the summer of 1541, the progress to the north. This was no small outing. It was one of the grandest spectacles of Henry's entire reign, the king and queen, and a vast train of courtiers, servants, guards, baggage, and horses, thousands of people, winding slowly up through the kingdom toward the city of York. There were reasons of state behind it. The north of England had risen in rebellion against Henry a few years earlier, a great revolt that had badly frightened the crown, and the king wished to show himself in those regions in overwhelming majesty, to remind the north exactly who ruled it. He also hoped, on this journey, to meet his nephew, the King of Scots, a meeting that in the end never came. The progress was about power and display and the assertion of royal control over a restless land. And in the middle of all that pageantry, night after night, in town after town along the route, at Lincoln, at Pontefract, and onward, the Queen of England was slipping away to secret meetings with Thomas Culpeper. A Rochford arranged them. They would meet late, in private chambers, sometimes reached by back stairs, with Jane Boleyn keeping watch against discovery. The court was huge and crowded and constantly on the move, which made concealment both easier and infinitely more dangerous. There were 1,000 eyes, 1,000 servants, 1,000 mouths. To carry on a secret liaison under those conditions, with the king himself sleeping nearby, was an act of breathtaking recklessness, or of a young woman so starved for tenderness and so untrained in fear that she could not properly grasp the size of the cliff she was dancing along. We have, from this period, one of the most extraordinary documents in all of Tudor history, and it is the single most human thing Catherine Howard ever left behind. It is a letter, written in her own hand, to Thomas Culpeper. It survived because it was later seized and used as evidence against them both, which is a bitter irony. The one piece of her own voice that endures is the very piece that helped to kill her. In it, she writes to him with open, aching affection. She tells him that her heart troubles her when she hears he is unwell. She tells him how she longs for his company, how it grieves her to be apart from him. And she signs it with a phrase that has echoed down the centuries, precisely because it is so terribly, innocently sincere from a girl who had almost no life left to give, that she is his as long as life endures, yours as long as life endures. She could not have known how short that life was about to be, or that her own loving words, set down on paper, would help to measure it. And then, into the middle of this dangerous summer, the past walked back in through the front door. At Pontefract, during the progress, Francis Dereham reappeared, the man from the maiden's chamber, the husband and wife of her unwatched childhood. He came seeking advancement, pressing to be given a place in the Queen's household, and there is every reason to believe that what lay behind his request was a quiet, ugly leverage. He knew what they had been to each other, and a man who knows a queen's secret is a man who can make demands. And Catherine, instead of refusing him and putting distance between herself and the most dangerous evidence of her past, did the opposite. In late August of 1541, she took Francis Dereham into her household and made him her private secretary. Perhaps she felt she had no choice. Perhaps it was the only way she knew to keep him quiet. But whatever the reason, she had now pulled the buried mine of her childhood right into her own household and seated it at her own side, even as she crept out at night to meet Culpeper. The man who knew her past and the man who endangered her present were now both within arm's reach. The fuses of both were lit. All that remained was for someone, somewhere, to remember and to talk. That autumn, the great progress wound its way home. The enormous train of the court came back down through the kingdom and arrived at last at Hampton Court at the end of October. The king was happier than he had been in years. He believed himself blessed in his marriage, restored, contented at last with his rose without a thorn. He had no idea that while he had been parading his majesty through the north, his young wife had been slipping through back doors in the dark. And he had no idea that, in his absence, a man he had never heard of had already gone to the Archbishop of Canterbury with a story about a queen, and that the story was true. The man who set the ending in motion was not a great lord or a jealous rival. He was a relatively minor figure named John Lascelles, and what moved him was not personal hatred of Catherine at all. It was, in part, religion, and to understand that, you have to remember the war that was being fought, quietly and viciously, beneath the surface of Henry's court. England in 1541 was a kingdom torn down the middle of its own soul. Henry had broken from the Pope and made himself head of the Church, but the question of what that Church should actually be, how Reformed, how Protestant, how close to or far from the old Catholic ways, was bitterly unresolved, and the great families and factions of the court lined up on opposing sides of it. The Howards, Catherine's family, were the standard bearers of the conservative, traditional, Catholic-leaning party. Their rise through Catherine's marriage was a victory for the old religion, and so, to the men who longed for a more thoroughly reformed England, the young queen was not merely a person, she was a symbol of the wrong side winning. Bringing her down would mean bringing down the whole Howard ascendancy with her. John Lascelles was a committed reformer. He had every reason, of conscience and of faction both, to want the rose without a thorn pulled out by the roots. But he could not have done it without something to say, and what he had was a sister. Here is where a thread we left dangling long ago is finally pulled tight. Cast your mind back to the maiden's chamber, to the stolen key that let Francis Derham in at night. The maid who took that key for Catherine was named Mary Lascelles. That same Mary, later known by her married name, Mary Hall, had served in the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk's household alongside the young Catherine, and she had seen, with her own eyes, everything that went on there. The music master's familiarity, the nights with Derham, the whole careless truth of it. And Mary Lascelles was John Lascelles's sister, the girl from the unwatched house, and the reformer who would destroy the queen were brother and sister, the key that opened the door of the maiden's chamber. And the mouth that opened the door of the queen's ruin belonged to the same family. The past Catherine thought she had left behind in Lambeth had been living, all along, inside the family of a man with every motive to use it, when John Lascelles suggested to his sister that she might seek a comfortable position in the new queen's household, a sensible ambition for a woman of her connections. Mary refused, and her reason was chilling in its bluntness. She would not serve this queen, she said, because the queen was light, both in her living and in her conditions. Loose, in other words, in her morals and her conduct. Pressed by her brother to explain such a dangerous thing to say about the king's wife, Mary told him everything she had witnessed in the Dowager Duchess's house years before. And John Lascelles, whether from conscience or from calculation, or from the tangled mixture of both that drives most human action, decided he could not keep it to himself. He went to Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Cranmer was, in his way, the perfect and the most terrible man for this information to reach. He was the most senior churchman in England, a close and trusted adviser to the king, and a man who himself leaned toward reform, which is to say, a man with no love for the Catholic Howards and quiet reasons to welcome their fall. He had never approved of the king's marriage to Catherine, and now a piece of information had landed in his lap that could destroy her. But it was also information of the most appalling delicacy, because it concerned the chastity and the honor of the king's beloved wife, and the king was deliriously, dangerously happy in that marriage. To carry such a tale to Henry VIII was to risk the messenger's own neck. Cranmer did not act alone. He took counsel quietly with two of the most powerful men in the realm, the Lord Chancellor, Thomas Audley, and Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford, himself a leader of the reforming party and the uncle of the little prince. Together they weighed how to handle a thing that could not safely be handled at all, and they decided that Cranmer should not speak the accusation aloud to the king's face. He should write it down and put the letter into Henry's hands and let the king read the horror in private. The moment chosen was the first days of November, 1541, in the season of All Saints and All Souls, when the king was at his devotions. By one account, the blow fell on the 2nd of November. Henry was attending Mass, and we should pause on the awful timing, because only a day or two before, the king had ordered special prayers of thanksgiving for the happiness of his marriage, had openly thanked God for the good life he led and hoped to go on leading with his young wife. He was, in his own mind, a man blessed, and it was in the middle of this contented piety that Cranmer's letter reached him. A quiet sheet of paper, laying out, in careful words, the allegation that the Queen had not come to him a virgin, that there had been men before him, that the rose without a thorn had a hidden and dishonorable past. Henry's first reaction was not rage, it was disbelief. He simply did not believe it. He thought the letter was a slander, a forgery, a malicious plot against an innocent woman, and that reaction tells you, more than anything, how genuinely he loved her, or loved what she represented to him. This was a king who had been all too willing to believe monstrous things about Anne, Boleyn when he wanted to be rid of her. With Catherine, he did not want to believe, and so at first he did not. He ordered a secret investigation, not to convict his wife, but to clear her name, to prove the slander false and punish whoever had invented it. He wanted the accusation to be a lie. It was not a lie, and the inquiry he ordered to save her would become the machine that destroyed her, because once the king's men began, quietly, to pull on the threads, everything Catherine had ever hidden began to come apart in their hands. The investigation meant to prove her innocent would, within a matter of days, uncover not only the buried truth of her past, but a far deadlier truth about her present that no one, not Cranmer, not Lascelles, not Henry himself, had yet even suspected. It began, as these things always began in Henry's England, with frightened people in cold rooms being asked questions they did not dare answer wrongly. The king's counselors moved quickly and quietly. Mary Lascelles was found and questioned, and she confirmed steadily every word she had told her brother. The men named in her account were seized. Henry Manox, the music master of years before, was detained. Francis Derham, the Queen's own newly appointed secretary, the man she had so recklessly taken into her household only weeks earlier, was arrested. And under interrogation, the two men told what had happened in the Dowager Duchess's house. There was little point in denying it. Too many people had known, the household had gossiped about it for years, and the truth of the early relationships was not really in doubt. Manox spoke of the touching, the familiarity. Derham spoke of the nights, the shared bed, the understanding between them that had been, in all but a priest's blessing, a marriage. For a few days the scandal looked as though it might stay contained within Catherine's past, damaging, humiliating, a stain on the Queen's honor, and a weapon for her enemies, but concerning only the years before she ever met the king, a queen who had not been a virgin at her marriage, who had perhaps even been pre-contracted to another man, was a disaster. But it was, arguably, a survivable disaster, an annulment, a quiet setting aside, a return to obscurity. It was the kind of ending Anne of Cleves had been granted. Catherine's past alone might not have killed her. But the investigators kept pulling, and the threads kept giving way, and then they reached the present, and the present was treason. It was Derrickham, most likely, trying to save his own life, who turned the key. Cornered, attempting to argue that his relationship with Catherine belonged to the past, and that another man had since taken his place in her affections, he gave the investigators a name they had not been looking for. Thomas Culpeper, the gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber, and suddenly the inquiry changed its entire nature. This was no longer a question of what an unwatched girl had done years before she was queen. This was the possibility that the reigning Queen of England had been meeting, secretly and intimately, with one of the king's own intimate servants, during the marriage, behind the king's back, on the very progress where Henry had been parading his majesty through the north. If that were true, it was not a matter of damaged honor. It was adultery in a queen, and the betrayal of the king's bloodline, and the law of England called that high treason, and the punishment for high treason was death. The queen's ladies were questioned, one after another, and at the center of the questioning, eventually, stood Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, the woman who had carried the messages and watched the doors. Confronted, she confessed her part, that she had helped to arrange the secret meetings between Catherine and Culpeper. The survivor of 1536 had finally been caught in the very kind of net that had destroyed her husband. And Catherine's own loving letter to Culpeper, the one in her own hand, surfaced as evidence. Her tenderness turned into testimony against her. And then they came for the Queen herself. Catherine was confined to her chambers at Hampton Court, while the world she had been the center of dissolved around her. And on the 7th of November, Thomas Cranmer, the same archbishop whose letter had begun it all, was sent to interrogate her. What he found there has come down to us in his own words, and it is one of the few moments in this whole story where you can hear, across 5 centuries, the sound of a human being breaking. Cranmer had gone in prepared to deal with a guilty woman. Instead, he found a girl in such a state of terror and grief that he could barely conduct the questioning at all. He wrote afterward that he found her in such lamentation and heaviness as he had never seen in any creature, and that her distress was so extreme he genuinely feared she might lose her reason entirely, that the sheer terror of her situation might tip her into madness before they could ever bring her to confess. This hardened churchman, this veteran of the Tudor court, was shaken by the sight of her. He changed his approach. He spoke to her gently, held out to her the possibility of the king's mercy, tried to calm the hysteria enough to get coherent words out of her, and slowly, in pieces, the confession came. Catherine admitted the relationship with Derrickham from her years in the Dowager Duchess's house, that he had known her as a man knows his wife many times. She admitted the earlier business with Manox. On the matter of Culpeper she was more guarded, and this is a point where honesty demands real care, because here the simple story and the actual evidence pull apart. Catherine admitted the secret meetings with Culpeper. She admitted the longing, the danger, the foolishness of it, but whether the meetings ever became fully, physically adulterous, whether the thing the law would hang her for had actually, bodily, occurred, is something the surviving record never cleanly establishes. Both Catherine and Culpeper, under interrogation, stopped short of confessing to consummated adultery. Each tended to throw the greater blame onto the other and onto Lady Rochford. It is entirely possible that the Queen of England went to her death for an affair that, in the strictest physical sense, may never have been completed at all. What is certain is that she had met a man in secret, at night with a go-between, behind her husband's back, and had written him a love letter. And in the eyes of a wronged and terrifying king, and of the law he commanded, that intent and that betrayal were more than enough. The distinction between what she did and what she died for is one of the quiet cruelties at the heart of this case. The machinery of the state ground forward regardless. On the 14th of November, 1541, Catherine Howard was removed from Hampton Court, the palace of her brief glory, and taken under guard to Sion, a former monastery turned holding place a little way up the river. About a week later, she was deprived of the title and dignity of queen. She was no longer a queen. She was, once again, merely Mistress Catherine Howard, the girl from Lambeth, as though the throne had been a borrowed gown taken back. The world she had ruled was dismantled around her with brisk efficiency. Her household, the great train of gentlewomen and servants who had attended the Queen of England, was broken up and scattered. One by one, the people who had served her were questioned about what they had seen and heard, every memory of the progress and the private chambers pulled out of them, every loyalty tested against the danger of withholding. To have been close to Catherine Howard was now a peril in itself, and those who could put distance between themselves and the fallen queen did so quickly. The glittering court that had revolved around her in the autumn had by the end of November simply ceased to exist. Sion itself was a strange and fitting place to keep her. It had been one of the great religious houses of England, a wealthy abbey, until the king's own dissolution of the monasteries had emptied it and turned it to the crown's purposes. Now its silent, stripped halls became a gilded prison for the girl, whose marriage was a triumph of the conservative, old religion party. There she was, held with only a small remnant of attendants, a handful of gentlewomen and servants permitted to her, lodged in modest chambers and stripped of every outward mark of royalty. No canopies of estate above her head, no queenly splendor, the gowns and the jewels of her glory taken back. She was once more and for the last time simply Mistress Catherine Howard, waiting in a hollow house that had once belonged to nuns, and the waiting, in the end, may have been its own particular torture. Weeks passed, and then more weeks. The short, dark days of December giving way to the deeper cold of January, while the lawyers and counselors decided her fate at a distance, in rooms she would never see, in a process she had no part in. She did not know the day, she did not know the manner. She only knew, with the certainty that had settled over her the moment Cranmer first questioned her, that it would end in her death, and that all that remained uncertain was when. A person can sometimes bear a known horror more easily than an unknown one held just out of sight, and Catherine was left for the better part of 3 months to sit in a decommissioned abbey and imagine her own ending, over and over, without ever being told its shape. By the time they finally came to move her, the dread had had a long time to do its work. She was not yet condemned to death. That would take a little longer, and it would require a particular kind of legal machinery because there was a problem the king's lawyers had to solve first. But the men who had drawn her into the dark with her, the favorite from the king's bedchamber and the secretary from her own childhood, had no such reprieve. Their reckoning came first, and before Catherine ever saw the tower, the heads of Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham would already be waiting for her there. Lifted high above the river road, she would be forced to travel. The men were dealt with first, and they were dealt with according to the brutal arithmetic of Tudor rank, which decided not whether you died, but how much you suffered in the dying. On the 1st of December, 1541, Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham were brought to trial together at the Guildhall in London. The outcome was never in doubt. Trials of this kind, in cases the king had already decided, were a formality dressed as justice. Both men were convicted of high treason. Culpeper for his treasonous dealings with the Queen. Durham, who protested that whatever he had done with Catherine belonged to the years before her marriage and could not be treason against a king she had not yet wed, was condemned anyway. The law bent and stretched to make certain he did not escape. Both were sentenced to die. They were executed on the 10th of December, 1541, at Tyburn, the grim place of public death outside the city. And here the arithmetic of rank showed itself. Culpeper, as a gentleman of the Privy Chamber and a man of standing, was granted what passed for mercy. His sentence was commuted, and he was beheaded, a swift death by the axe. Durham was given no such mercy. He suffered the full, deliberate horror that the law reserved for traitors of lower degree, the punishment designed to be as prolonged and as agonizing and as publicly degrading as human cruelty could engineer. He was hanged, cut down while still living, and then butchered. It was death made into a spectacle and a warning, and the contrast between his end and Culpeper's says everything about a world in which even the manner of your execution depended on the accident of your birth. And then their heads were taken and parboiled to slow their rotting, and impaled on spikes on London Bridge, the great bridge over the Thames, lined with the heads of traitors as a permanent advertisement of royal vengeance. There the heads of the two men who had loved, or used, or endangered Catherine Howard were set up above the river, gazing blindly out over the water and the city. Remember where they were placed. The river was the road, and the road would soon carry Catherine herself. But before it could, the king's lawyers had a problem to solve, and the way they solved it tells you how absolutely the law had become a tool in Henry's hand. There were two women still to be dealt with, Catherine and Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, and both presented difficulties. In Jane's case, the difficulty was her mind. During her imprisonment in the Tower, the woman who had survived the destruction of the Boleyns in 1536 finally broke, under the weight of facing destruction a second time. She descended into what the reports of the day called madness, a genuine mental collapse, witnessed and recorded by the imperial ambassador, who noted that she showed every symptom of insanity. And under the long-established law of England, you could not execute a person who was insane. To put a madwoman to death was held to be a kind of barbarism, even by the standards of the age. By that law, Jane Boleyn should have been spared. The king did not want her spared. And so Henry did something that is genuinely chilling in its cold efficiency. He had Parliament pass a new law, crafted for the occasion, declaring that a person convicted of high treason could be executed even if they were insane. A statute was written into the law of the land for the specific purpose of allowing the king to kill a woman who had lost her reason. The English state reached into its own ancient mercy and tore it out, on command, so that one broken widow would not slip through. In Catherine's case, the difficulty was different. To put her on trial would mean a public spectacle, the parading of the Queen's shame before the world, the airing of every sordid detail, and there was always the small, dangerous possibility that a trial might not go entirely to plan. So the king's men chose a tidier instrument. They used a bill of attainder. An attainder was a monstrous device, an act of Parliament that simply declared a person guilty and condemned them to death, with no trial at all, no defense, no jury, no chance to answer. The legislature itself pronounced the sentence. The Bill of Attainder against Catherine Howard and Jane Boleyn was introduced into Parliament on the 21st of January, 1542. It swept aside any need to prove anything in a courtroom. It simply declared them condemned. The act carried one further provision so revealing that it deserves a moment of its own. Folded into the law that killed Catherine was a new rule for the future. It was henceforth made treason for any woman whom the king intended to marry, to conceal from him a history of unchaste living. In other words, the lesson Henry drew from the ruin of his fifth marriage was that any future bride was now legally obligated, on pain of death, to disclose her sexual past to him before the wedding. The law did not ask whether a girl had been groomed, or abused, or failed by the adults around her. It asked only whether she had concealed her history from the king, and made that concealment a capital crime. It is hard to imagine a colder monument to what Catherine's story meant to the man at the center of it. The king would not sign the death warrant with his own hand. Whether from grief or squeamishness, or some last flicker of feeling for the girl he had called his Rose, Henry arranged for the act to receive royal assent by commission, by proxy, rather than by his own signature. On the 11th of February, 1542, that assent was given, and the warrant became law. Catherine Howard was now formally condemned to die by an act of Parliament she had never been allowed to answer. By then, the final journey had already begun. On the 10th of February, Catherine had been brought from Sion down the river toward the Tower, and the route lay along the Thames, beneath London Bridge. And so the barge carrying the condemned girl passed under the bridge, where the heads of Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham still stood upon their spikes. The favorite from the king's chamber, and the secretary from her childhood, the man of her present, and the man of her past, lifted high above her as she glided beneath them toward her own death. We do not know whether she looked up. We can only hope for her sake that she did not. She came at last to the Tower's Watergate and was taken in through it, into the same fortress where, not 6 years before, her cousin Anne had been brought to die. The walls that had swallowed one, Howard Queen, now closed around a second. And there, inside the Tower, in the last days that remained to her, Catherine Howard did the thing that this entire story has been moving toward. The thing that has carried her name across 5 centuries, the thing we left in the dark all the way back at the beginning. We are ready now to understand it completely. We began in a cold room with a girl and a block and a request that has unsettled everyone who ever heard it. We can return to that room now, and this time, nothing about it will be mysterious, because now we know everything that brought her there. It was Sunday, the 12th of February, 1542. Inside the Tower, the men of the King Council came to Catherine and told her plainly what the morning would bring. She was to die in the morning. There would be no reprieve, no mercy, no sudden turn. The act was passed, the warrant was law, the scaffold was being built. She had, at most, a few hours of life remaining, and she knew it to the minute. And it was that evening, having been told she would die in the morning, that she made her request. She asked that the block, the wooden block on which her head would be severed, be brought to her, into her room that night. The council granted it. The block was carried in, and Catherine knelt down beside it and, by the account the imperial ambassador set down within days of the event, she made trial of it. She placed herself upon it to learn how she should position her body when the moment came. The record does not measure the length of that rehearsal. Its horror lies in the fact that she asked for it at all. For 500 years, people have recoiled from that image and not known what to do with it. It has been told as proof of her vanity, or her foolishness, or her childish theatricality, the silly girl playing at her own death. But understand now what you are actually looking at, with everything we have learned. 2 things were true in that room, and together they explain everything. The first is what the people of that age believed about death itself. In Tudor England, how you died was held to be one of the most important things about you. A final, public testament to the state of your soul and the strength of your honor. To die well meant to die with composure and faith and dignity, to meet the end without collapsing into terror, to give a fitting speech and submit with grace. A good death could redeem a ruined life in the eyes of those watching. A bad death, a screaming, struggling, undignified death, was a kind of damnation laid bare before the world. Catherine had been stripped of her crown, her honor, her name, and very nearly her humanity. The one thing left that she could still control, the one last statement she could still make about who she was the manner in which she died. She wanted to die well, and so she rehearsed. The second thing is simpler and more human, and it is the reason the rehearsal breaks the heart, rather than merely chilling it. Catherine was terrified of a botched execution, and she had every reason in the world to be. Cast your mind back to the old woman she had once sent warm clothing to in this very fortress. Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury. Only 9 months earlier, in the spring of 1541, Margaret had been dragged to the block in this same tower and subjected to one of the most appalling executions of the entire reign. An inexperienced or panicking headsman who did not kill her cleanly, who hacked at the old woman again and again, butchering rather than beheading her. Catherine would have known. The whole court would have known. And now it was Catherine's turn to lay her own neck beneath an axe, and the horror of dying the way Margaret Pole had died, slowly, messily, in agony, hacked at blow after blow, must have been unspeakable. So she asked for the block. She made trial of it in the dark, learning how she should place herself, so that when the moment came she would not panic, would not misplace her body, and would give the headsman the best chance of ending it quickly. The rehearsal was not vanity. It was a frightened girl trying, with the only means available to her, to make certain her death would be quick. The morning came. By the account of the imperial ambassador, the king's counselors arrived at the tower soon after 7 o'clock. The French ambassador, who was not himself present, reported the hour somewhat later, and on this small detail the sources disagree, as sources often do. What is clear is that in the cold early light, on Tower Green, within the private walls of the fortress, the same merciful privacy that had been granted to her cousin Anne spared the jeering of a public crowd. The scaffold stood waiting, and Catherine was brought out to it. The two accounts that survive of how she met it do not perfectly agree. And rather than smooth them into one comfortable version, it is fairer to give you both, because the truth almost certainly lies in holding them together. The French ambassador, reporting at second hand, said she was so weak that she could hardly speak. A portrait of a girl nearly undone by terror, but an eyewitness, a London merchant named Otwell Johnson, who was actually there and wrote of it to his brother 2 days later, described something else. He wrote of her steadfastness, her constancy, the godly and Christian composure of her end. Both can be true. She may well have needed help to climb the scaffold steps, pale and shaking with a fear no rehearsal could fully master, and still have gathered herself, when the moment came, to die with exactly the dignity she had spent the night preparing for. A person can be terrified and brave at once. Indeed, that is very often what bravery actually is. This execution, like her cousins before her, was not staged for the roaring crowds of Tower Hill, where common traitors died before a sea of jeering strangers. It was held within the walls of the fortress, on the green, in a kind of grim privacy, one of the few considerations the crown still extended to a fallen queen, sparing her the open mockery of the mob. But privacy did not mean solitude. A scaffold had been raised and strewn with straw to drink the blood. Around it gathered the witnesses the law required, the great men of the King's Council, the Lord Mayor of London, and the city's aldermen, and a scattering of others permitted within the gates to see the King's justice done. The morning was bitter, a February cold biting through wool and fur, the light still thin and gray. Henry was not among them. The man who had called her his rose without a thorn, who had wept and raged when her secrets were uncovered, did not come to watch the axe fall on the girl he had married. He stayed away, exactly as he had stayed away from Anne, and two of the mightiest men in the kingdom were absent as well. The Duke of Suffolk, the king's old companion, was unwell, and the Duke of Norfolk, Catherine's own uncle, the cold architect who had set her in the king's path, as he had once set Anne, found reason not to attend the killing of his niece. In the very weeks he was busy disowning the rest of his disgraced family to save his own neck. He had advanced two nieces to the throne and seen both of them condemned, and he could not be troubled to watch either of them die. But not every Howard turned away. Among the witnesses on the green stood her cousin, the young Earl of Surrey, Norfolk's brilliant son, the poet, a man who would himself one day kneel at a tower block on the orders of this same king. He was there, whatever he felt, watching another of his own blood destroyed. The records do not preserve. He simply stood among the counselors in the cold and watched a teenage girl of his family prepare to die. There were rules to a scaffold, unwritten but iron, and everyone present understood them. The condemned was expected to acknowledge the justice of the sentence, to make no protest against the king, to confess themselves a sinner deserving of death, to forgive the executioner, and to pay him for his work. For it was the headsman's blade and the headsman's aim that decided whether the end would be a mercy or a butchery, and a wise victim wanted that man calm, well paid, and steady. To break those rules, to rage or to accuse or to deny, was not only futile but dangerous to the family one left behind, since a king's vengeance could reach past the grave to the living. Catherine, who had spent her last night rehearsing the silent, physical act of dying, had every reason to observe the spoken rules as carefully as she had practiced the wordless one. The executioner knelt before her, as custom demanded, and asked her forgiveness for what he was about to do. She gave it, and gave him his payment. Then she spoke her last words to the assembled witnesses, and here we arrive at the famous line, the one I promised. At the very beginning, that we would drag into the light. You have very likely heard it. It is repeated constantly in books and films and idle retellings, that Catherine Howard, standing on the scaffold, cried out, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." It is dramatic, it is defiant, it is romantic, and it is almost certainly a complete fabrication. That line does not come from any eyewitness. It does not appear in the account of Otwell Johnson, who stood there and watched. It does not appear in the careful dispatches of the imperial ambassador, who reported the executions in detail. It comes, instead, from a single late and notoriously unreliable source, an anonymous chronicle, written from a distance and riddled with errors that later historians have learned to treat with deep suspicion. The line contradicts the eyewitness testimony. It contradicts every convention of how the condemned actually spoke on the scaffold. It would have been an act of reckless cruelty toward her own family, still imprisoned and in peril, to die with a public boast of adultery on her lips. And it would have been strange in the extreme for her to call herself a queen at all, when she had been formally stripped of that very title months before. The defiant, romantic Catherine of legend, flinging her love for Culpeper in the face of the watching court, never existed. She was invented later, because a defiant ending made a better story than the truth. The truth, recorded by the man who was actually there, is quieter and far more devastating. Catherine spoke the conventional words of a penitent going to her death. She acknowledged that she had grievously offended. She said her punishment was worthy and just. She professed her faith. She asked the people watching to take warning from her example and to amend their own lives. And she prayed for the king, for his long life, his preservation, his welfare. The girl who had crept out at night to meet a young man, the girl history painted as a brazen wanton, spent her final breath praying for the well-being of the husband who was, in that very moment, having her killed. There was no defiance in it. There was submission and fear and a terrible school dignity. Then she knelt and laid her head upon the block, the same block she had rehearsed against through the night, and positioned herself exactly as she had practiced, and the axe fell. By every account, it took her head with a single stroke. Whatever she had feared, the end was not botched. She did not die the way Margaret Pole had died. She died fast and clean, and that small mercy was the one she had spent her last night securing for herself. She was, by the reckoning of most who have studied her, no more than 19 years old. She may have been younger. And then it was Jane Boland's turn. The woman who had survived 1536, who had returned to court and made herself the keeper of a young queen's most dangerous secrets, was brought up onto the same scaffold, beside the same block, still wet. By the ambassador's account, the madness that had gripped her in her cell had lifted, or been forced back, in the face of death. She too spoke briefly, confessing her faults and praying for the king, and she too was beheaded with a single blow. 2 women, 2 strokes one cold February morning. Their bodies were taken up and carried the short distance to the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, the small church within the walls of the tower where the kingdom buried the great, and the it had killed within those walls. And there Catherine Howard was laid to rest near the body of Anne Boleyn, her first cousin, the other Howard girl, the other young queen beheaded by the same king who had been buried in that same chapel almost exactly 6 years before. 2 cousins, 2 queens, 2 of Henry's wives, both raised up by the ambition of the same family, both destroyed by the same husband, both beheaded within the same fortress, both buried within the same small church, a few years and a few feet apart. There is one last strange footnote to her resting place. Centuries later, in the reign of Queen Victoria, the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula was restored, and in the course of the work the ground was disturbed and searched, and the remains of those long-dead prisoners were sought, and, where possible, identified and reburied with some dignity. When the area associated with Catherine Howard was examined, no certain trace of her was found. Her young body, like so much else about her, had simply slipped away into the dark, unaccounted for. She is remembered now in that chapel by a name on a memorial. But of the girl herself, even in the ground, almost nothing remained to be found. Before we follow the wreckage outward, there is one question that hangs over this entire case and refuses to leave, and we owe it an honest answer. Was there ever a way out? In all of that closing machinery, the interrogations, the confessions, the attainder, the axe, was there a single door that might have led somewhere other than the block? The answer, and it is one of the cruelest facts in the whole story, is yes, there was a door, and it was quietly, deliberately nailed shut. To find it, we have to look first at what the men actually said when the king's officers had them in their hands, because their words shaped the law that killed her. Thomas Culpeper, under questioning, did not give a clean confession of completed adultery. What he confessed to was something subtler and, in the logic of treason, no less fatal. He admitted that he had intended to do wrong with the queen, and that he believed she had meant the same with him. Intent. Not necessarily the act, but the meaning behind the meetings, the purpose of those secret midnight hours. And in the brutal reasoning of the treason law, the intent to violate the king's bloodline could be as deadly as the deed itself. A man could be destroyed for what he had set out to do, whether or not he had finished it. Culpeper also did what frightened, cornered men so often do. He reached for someone else to blame, and the someone closest to hand was Catherine. He cast the queen as the one who had wanted it, who had drawn him in. It was the opening note of a song that would be sung about her for 500 years. That whatever had happened, the girl had been the cause of it. But the real door, the one that might genuinely have led to life, was not in Culpepper's confession at all. It was buried in the wreckage of her childhood, in that question we left unanswered long ago in the maidens' chamber, the question of the pre-contract. Recall what that meant under the law of the church, that a man and a woman who freely exchanged words of present consent and then consummated them were truly, bindingly married in the eyes of God, ceremony or no ceremony, priest or no priest. And recall that the household had whispered, even at the time, that nobody could quite tell whether what passed between Catherine and Francis Dereham had made them husband and wife. Now follow the thread to where it leads, because it leads somewhere extraordinary. If Catherine and Dereham had truly been pre-contracted, if their bond in that dormitory amounted to a real exchange of consent, then Catherine had a lawful husband before she ever laid eyes on the king. And if she already had a husband, then her marriage to Henry was no marriage at all. It was void from the very beginning, a thing that had never legally existed. And here is the lifeline hidden inside that grim technicality. A woman who was never truly the king's wife could not possibly be guilty of adultery against him. And with no adultery against the king, there could be no treason. The whole towering charge that was about to take her head rested on her being Henry's lawful queen. Remove the marriage, and the treason collapsed with it. This was not some far-fetched legal fantasy. The proof that it could work was standing alive and comfortable not far away in the person of Anne of Cleves. Henry's fourth marriage had been dissolved on precisely this kind of ground. A prior commitment, a flawed and unconsummated union, a marriage declared never properly valid. And Anne had not only survived it, she had been enriched and honored and styled the king's beloved sister. The machine that could unmake a royal marriage on a technicality had been oiled and run barely a year before, and everyone at court had watched it work. In theory, the very same machine could have been turned to Catherine's case. Declare the marriage void on the basis of the Dereham pre-contract, and Catherine Howard would have walked out of it not as a traitor bound for the scaffold, but as a disgraced and discarded ex-wife, humiliated, ruined, sent away into obscurity, but breathing. So why did the door stay shut? Why did the girl die when the law itself held an exit? The answer comes in two parts, and both of them are damning. The first part is that the lifeline required someone to grasp it, and no one did, least of all Catherine herself. When she was questioned about Dereham, she did not claim the pre-contract. She admitted the relationship, the nights, the intimacy, but she denied that there had been any binding promise of marriage between them. Dereham, for his part, said the opposite. Cornered and trying to argue that his dealings with Catherine had been lawful and belonged to the time before she was queen, he insisted that the two of them had indeed been as good as married, pre-contracted in truth. So you had the strange and terrible spectacle of the condemned man asserting the very fact that could have saved the condemned woman, and the woman denying it. Why would Catherine refuse the one thing that might have spared her? Almost certainly because she had no idea that it could spare her. She had no lawyer. She had no counsel. She had no one at her side whose task it was to defend her, or to whisper that there was a legal escape if only she would reach for it. She was interrogated, not represented. She was a frightened teenager being questioned by the most powerful churchmen and counselors in the kingdom, and no one in that room was on her side. It is entirely possible, it is in truth, likely, that the door to her own survival stood open beside her, and she was never told it was there. The second part is darker still, and it is about the men who held the power. Even if the pre-contract had been pressed, the crown did not want the escape used. An annulment would have carried a price that Henry's wounded vanity could not bear to pay. To dissolve the marriage on the grounds of a pre-contract was to announce to the world that the king had, once again, been married to no one, that his judgment had failed a second time, that the radiant young rose he had paraded before Europe had been another man's wife the whole time, and that he had been made a fool of by a girl from Lambeth. And beyond the wounded pride, there was the simple matter of tidiness. An annulled, living, disgraced ex-queen was a loose thread, a person who still existed, who could still be talked about, who was still out there in the world. The men around the king found it cleaner and far more satisfying to the rage of a betrayed husband to treat the marriage as real enough to make her betrayal treason and to close the whole humiliating chapter, not with a quiet pension and a country house, but with an axe. The door of the pre-contract was nailed shut from both sides, by a frightened girl who did not know to open it, and by powerful men who did not want it opened. And then the last possibility of any defense at all was removed by the instrument they chose to kill her with. She was never tried. There was no courtroom, no jury, no day in which she might have stood and argued the pre-contract or anything else before judges who could acquit her. She was condemned by an act of Parliament, a legislative pronouncement of guilt that required no trial and permitted no defense. The law that ended her was written precisely so that it would never have to hear her speak. A teenager with no lawyer, condemned by a statute, holding in her own ruined history the single legal key that might have unlocked her survival, a key she did not know she held, and that the men deciding her fate had no intention of letting her use. So when we ask whether Catherine Howard could have been saved, the honest answer is the most painful kind of yes. There was a theoretical way out. Anne of Cleves had shown that a royal marriage could be unmade by legal machinery rather than ended by blood. But Catherine's case was colder, uglier, and far more dangerous, because Henry did not merely want release from a wife. He wanted punishment. The law contained it. The precedent had just been set. The machinery existed and was in working order. But the escape lived only in the cold theory of canon law, and never once in Catherine's reach. She did not know to ask for it. No one offered it to her. And the men who could have opened it had already decided they would rather see her dead. The door was always there. It was simply never, for one moment, hers to open. With that door shut, there was nothing left to stop the killing. And the killing, as it turned out, did not stop with her. A queen does not fall alone. When Catherine Howard went down, she pulled a great deal of the world down with her, and the pattern of who suffered and who slipped free is its own bleak commentary on the age. The king's vengeance reached past the queen and the two dead men, to engulf the family that had raised her and pushed her forward. In the weeks around her condemnation, the net closed over the Howards. The charge against them was not treason itself, but a related crime. The offense of having known about the Queen's unchaste past and failed to reveal it, of having concealed what they should have disclosed. And so they were gathered in. The Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, the very woman in whose careless, unwatched household the whole tragedy had been seeded years before, was arrested and shut up in the Tower, her possessions seized, accused among other things of having meddled with Derham's belongings to hide the evidence. Catherine's uncle Lord William Howard and his wife were taken. Her aunt, the Countess of Bridgewater, was taken. A whole cluster of Howards and their connections found themselves imprisoned, condemned, their goods forfeited to the crown, around the close of 1541. There is a hard irony buried in that. The Dowager Duchess, who had failed so completely to protect the child placed in her charge, who had let a music master prey on her and a household run wild and a stolen key unlock a dormitory full of girls, was now imprisoned not for that failure, not for the neglect that had set everything in motion, but for trying to cover up its consequences once they threatened the crown. No one was ever punished for failing Catherine. The old woman was punished only for failing to protect the king from the knowledge of it. And yet, in the end, most of the Howards survived. The fury of a king, however terrible, was also a thing that could be waited out, and over the following months the imprisoned relatives were, one by one, pardoned and released, allowed to creep back into life with their reputations damaged but their heads attached. The family bent and bruised and endured. No one bent more nimbly than the man most responsible for placing Catherine on the throne in the first place. The Duke of Norfolk, her uncle, the cold architect of her marriage, did exactly what he had done once before when his other niece Anne had fallen. He saved himself. He distanced himself frantically from his disgraced kin, wrote letters dripping with horror at their crimes and protestations of his own loyalty, disowned the wreckage and survived. Twice now he had advanced a niece into the king's bed as an instrument of Howard ambition, and twice that niece had ended on the block, and twice Norfolk had walked away from the carnage intact, already calculating his next move. His luck would hold for a few more years, until his own house finally turned on him. In time, his brilliant son, the poet Earl of Surrey, would be condemned and executed for treason, and Norfolk himself would be sentenced to follow him to the scaffold. He was saved at the last possible moment by the only thing that could have saved him. The death of Henry VIII, who died in the small hours before the Duke's own execution, was to be carried out, leaving Norfolk to rot in prison instead of die. But that is a later story. In 1542, the man who had used Catherine like a playing card simply folded his hand and lived. The wider consequences rippled outward from the family into the very direction of the kingdom. Catherine's marriage had been a victory for the conservative, traditional religion party at court, and her catastrophic fall was, by the same logic, a defeat for them and a quiet triumph for their rivals. The men who had helped to bring her down, Cranmer, the Earl of Hertford, the reformers who longed for a more thoroughly Protestant England, emerged from the wreckage with their position strengthened and their hand at the king's elbow firmer than before. The girl from Lambeth had been, without ever once understanding it, a piece on a board far larger than her own life, and her removal shifted the whole game upon it. It is among the most disquieting truths of her story that some of the forces which destroyed her had little to do with anything she had personally done, and everything to do with what she had been made to represent. She was, in part, sacrificed to a long war over the soul of England that she had never enlisted in and could not have named. The faction that had raised her up to help win that war discovered, in her ruin, that they had instead handed their enemies a weapon, and the realm's slow drift toward reform, which would gather pace after Henry was gone, owed a small and grim debt to the downfall of a teenage queen who cared nothing for theology and only, fatally, for being loved. As for the king himself, the husband who had loved her, raised her, named her his rose, and then destroyed her, the discovery of her secrets had broken something in him that never quite mended. When the truth had finally been forced upon him, the man who at first refused to believe a word of it had collapsed into a grief so violent it frightened his own council. The reports tell of him weeping before his counselors, of rages, even of the king calling for a sword that he might kill her himself. The wound went deep, and it did not heal any better than the wound in his leg. The Henry who emerged from the ruin of his fifth marriage was older, sicker, heavier, more suspicious, more dangerous. The brief glow that Catherine had given him, the illusion of recovered youth, was gone for good, and what was left was a decaying tyrant grinding toward his own end. He would marry once more. About a year and a half after Catherine's execution, in the summer of 1543, Henry took his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, and the contrast between her and the girl who came before her tells you everything. Where Catherine Howard had been a teenager, untaught and unprotected, Catherine Parr was a mature woman, twice widowed, intelligent, careful, and politically shrewd. She had survived life already. She knew how to read a dangerous man. She trod carefully around the king's moods and his religion, and on at least one occasion talked her own way back from the very edge of his wrath. When she came under suspicion, she managed the one thing that had eluded almost all the others. She outlived him. Henry VIII died in January of 1547, less than 5 years after the axe fell on Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr walked away from the marriage alive. 6 wives. 2 of them beheaded, both of them Howard cousins, both buried in the same small chapel within the tower. And of those 6, the youngest, the least powerful, the least protected, the one who had been a child when the men first came for her in the dark, became, for the next 5 centuries, the one history chose to laugh at. It is worth asking, before we leave her, what history actually did with Catherine Howard once she was safely dead and could no longer speak for herself. Because what history did with her is, in its own quiet way, a second injustice laid on top of the first. She became a punchline. Across the centuries, in serious chronicles and popular tales alike, Catherine Howard was reduced to a type: the foolish little queen, the giddy good-time girl, the wanton, who could not control herself, and lost her head as the natural and faintly comic price of her own silliness. Her epitaph, "The rose without a thorn," was turned ironic and used to mock her. She was the lightweight among the 6 wives, the one mentioned with a smirk, the cautionary tale about what happens to a pretty girl with no sense. Even her face was taken from her. The portraits long pointed to as images of Catherine Howard are now doubted by experts. The identification's uncertain, so that we cannot even say for sure what she looked like. She comes down to us as a blur, a smudge of scandal with a punchline attached, barely a person at all. But go back to the records, the ones we have been reading together all this time, and that smirking caricature simply cannot survive contact with the evidence. Look again at the actual shape of her life, laid end to end. A girl born into a great name and a poor, overcrowded household. A mother dead too soon. A father drowning in his own debts and indifference. A child shipped off, low in the order of her family, to be raised in a glittering house where no adult could be bothered to truly watch her. And into that vacuum of care, the men. A music master who preyed on a 13-year-old and bragged about it. An older gentleman who made a quasi-marriage of a 14-year-old in a dormitory where the supposed protections were a stolen key away from meaningless. Modern eyes, looking at a child of 13 and 14 and the grown men who used her, do not see a precocious wanton. They see grooming, they see abuse, they see a child failed by every single adult who had a duty to protect her. And then the family that had ignored her suddenly found her useful. And so they handed her, this untaught, affection-starved teenager who had been shaped since infancy to believe that her only value lay in pleasing others, to a king in his 50s, a sick and dangerous man with a ruined leg and a temper that had already killed, a man old enough to be her grandfather, as a counter in a political game. She was set on a throne she had no preparation for, watched a man be beheaded on her own wedding day, and was expected to be all sweetness and to produce a son. When, lonely and reckless and entirely without guidance, she reached for tenderness in the worst possible way. The past that had been done to her as a child rose up, alongside the danger of her present, and the two together were used to destroy her. Perhaps, as we have seen, for a physical adultery that may never even have happened. And in the eyes of the law that killed her, the relevant crime was not that grown men had abused a child, but that the child had failed to confess it to the king. That is not the story of a silly girl, that is the story of a victim, failed in childhood, used in adolescence, and killed before she was 20. Which brings us, at the very last, back to the cold room where we began, and to the image in the title that drew you here. The teenage queen who asked to practice her own beheading. For 500 years that image has been offered as the final proof of how absurd she was. Kneeling in the dark, rehearsing her death, the ultimate foolish gesture from a foolish girl. Turn it over one last time, with everything you now know, and see what it actually was. This was a young woman who had spent her entire life having every important thing decided for her by other people. Where she would live, decided for her. Which men would have access to her, decided for her. Or simply allowed by those who should have prevented it. Whom she would marry, decided for her by an ambitious uncle. Whether she would be a queen, decided for her. Whether she would die, decided for her by an act of parliament she was never permitted to answer. In the whole of her short life, almost nothing had ever been hers to control. And in her final night, stripped of her crown and her name and her honor, condemned by a law she could not contest, with only hours left to live, she found the one thing that was, at last, hers. She could not choose to live. But she could choose how she met her death. She could refuse to die screaming and butchered like the old woman she had once pitied. She could decide to die well, and quickly, and with dignity, and she could prepare herself to do exactly that. So she had the block brought in, and she knelt to it in the dark, and she practiced. Not out of vanity, not out of foolishness, but out of a fierce and lonely determination that the single death she had been given would be a good one. She rehearsed her own beheading because it was the last and only act of self-possession available to a girl from whom everything else had been taken. And in the morning, by the account of the man who watched her, the rehearsal held. She met the axe with composure, prayed for the husband killing her, laid her head exactly where she had taught herself to lay it, and died with a single stroke. The world remembered her as the queen who was too silly to keep her head. The records remember something else entirely. They remember a frightened, failed, abandoned child who, in the last hours of a life that was never her own, taught herself how to die with dignity, and then did. That is who knelt beside the block in the dark, not a fool. A girl who had finally, terribly, taken control of the only thing left to her. Her name was Catherine Howard. She was probably 18 or 19 years old, though the surviving records do not let us fix her age with certainty. And she deserved, in life and in memory both, so much better than the men around her, and the centuries after them, ever gave her.